Welcome to the Successful Nonprofits Bonus Break. I'm your host, Dolph Goldenberg. The bonus break is a short episode you can listen to while taking a coffee break and get the added bonus of making you and your nonprofit more successful. Produced as a companion to our longer Successful Nonprofits podcast, the bonus break covers all of the topics you care most about: professional development, fundraising, governance, board relations, marketing, tech, and more. Now, I am just about to hop on a flight to New York City for an executive transition engagement, but this bonus break is so important that I literally had to sit down and record it before leaving for the airport. So I leave for the airport in like 45 minutes or so. Now, this bonus break is the first installment of a multi-part series about strategic planning. This series is based on a lunch and learn that I presented last month. And over the next several weeks, I'm going to be doing different pieces of that lunch and learn. The lunch and learn took about 75 minutes. And so we're going to break this out into 10, maybe 12-minute chunks. And so there's several different topics that we're going to cover. Today, we're going to be talking about determining if you need a new strategic plan and if your organization is ready to actually begin the planning process. Over the course of this series, we are also going to talk about understanding the planning process that almost every organization or consultant uses, exploring the roles of board members, staff, community volunteers, and consultants in strategic planning. Of course, how to raise the money necessary to hire a strategic planning consultant, or just host a stellar board retreat if that's all you need to raise money for. And we'll also end up at some point talking about how to overcome those internal and external objections to strategic planning. But again, today all we're going to be focusing on is determining if you need a new strategic plan and if you are ready to actually begin a planning process. Before we do that, let's first talk about what a strategic plan is. Some folks think of it as a roadmap, and it helps you figure out where you want to get to. So if you are currently at point A on the map and you know that you want to get to point D over the next 3 years, well, this helps you figure out what resources you need, what strategies and tactics you're going to use, and how you know you are moving toward D over the next several years. So essentially, you have quarterly or annual goals that you're able to measure by, hey, are we moving toward D? Are we moving in the right direction? And a good strategic plan ends up having about 12 different components. And at some point in the series, we're going to talk about all of those components as well. But again, today what we're talking about is, do you need a strategic plan? And are you ready to begin a strategic planning process? So, do you need a strategic plan? I'm going to say something controversial that a lot of consultants might disagree with. First of all, not every organization needs a strategic plan. If your organization, say, is a soup kitchen that has been around for 30 years and has fed 250 homeless people every Saturday for the last 30 years, you have a stable board. You don't necessarily want to do any major facility improvements in your soup kitchen. You don't want to grow your soup kitchen. You don't want to expand in any way. You have a clear understanding of how new leadership is secured from year to year and decade to decade so that you can continue to do your work. And of course, you don't want to expand in any other areas. You don't want to do advocacy around hunger and homelessness. Or you don't want to think about sheltering and, whether it's partnering with shelters or providing a shelter yourself. So as long as you're not looking at expansion, as long as you are stable and successful where you're at, and you don't want to be doing anything new or different, you probably don't need a strategic plan. Now, most of these are also probably really small organizations. So organizations with budgets of $50,000, $250,000, $500,000. Now, for all other organizations, you still need to ask yourself the question, do we need a new strategic plan right now? And so there's a series of things that you can kind of look at when you're trying to determine whether or not you need a new strategic plan. The first is, do you have funders that have requested a copy of your current strategic plan? And when they do you kind of wince and go, ooh, I don't really want to show them this plan because we're not really using it anymore. So if you wince when you think about sending your funders a copy of a strategic plan, or if you don't have a current plan to provide to funders, you might need to think about doing some planning. Some other things to think about is, how old is your most recent strategic plan? If it's more than 3 years old, again, it might be time to think about planning. A few other questions, and I actually have 7 or 8, and I've got a worksheet that we will link to on the Successful Nonprofits blog. So you can actually pull down this worksheet. It's kind of like a quiz. Take the quiz, see where your organization ranks, and determine whether or not you need a new strategic plan. But some of the other questions: are your board and staff structure sufficient to sustain the organization over the next 5 years? So when you look 5 years out, are you thinking, yeah, we don't have the right staff structure, or we don't have the right board structure to get us where we want to be in 5 years, or just to be who we are today in 5 years? Another question that's on this worksheet is, when did the board and the executive staff last refer to the strategic plan when making a decision? So obviously, the longer that was in the past, if the last time you actually referred to the plan when making a decision was 3 years ago, you're probably not using your plan, and it might actually be time to think about doing a new one. And then again, there's a number of questions on this quiz, but the other one that I want to point out is, how prepared is the organization for potential challenges and opportunities this year and next? So if you feel really well prepared for potential opportunities and challenges, whatever they may be, next year, you probably either already have a great strategic plan or don't need to necessarily thinking about doing one right now. But if, as you look out into the future, you don't feel 100% prepared, it's time to either refresh your current plan or to think about starting a new strategic planning process. So if you either have determined that you need a new strategic plan, or you have used the worksheet that's at the Successful Nonprofits blog website to help you figure out whether or not you need a new plan, and you do, how do you know whether or not you are actually ready to begin a planning process? So once again, there's a number of questions you have to ask yourself. And the first one is a resource question. Do you have the board talent and time necessary to work on it? And along with that, do you have the staff talent and time and the other volunteer leadership talent and time to work on the plan? Even when you bring a consultant in, the board and the executive staff are still going to need to do some work on making sure that the plan really represents what the organization wants to be doing. Something else that you've got to look at is, how stable is the organization right now? Organizations that are facing crisis tend not to be at a point where they're able to really engage in strategic planning. So if an organization is facing a financial crisis, a programmatic crisis, maybe an infrastructure crisis, whether that's HR or board or whatever, they probably need to first address that crisis and then think about planning. Otherwise, what's going to happen is they're going to create a 3-year or 4-year strategic plan that's really focused all on that crisis. And that crisis will be resolved in a year or 18 months. And suddenly you have a meaningless plan. So much like we offer a worksheet at the Successful Nonprofits blog to determine whether or not you need a new strategic plan, we also have a worksheet to determine whether or not you are ready to actually begin a strategic planning process. I've already talked about a couple of questions that are on that worksheet, but another one is, have you determined the cost of strategic planning, and have you identified the funding? Some organizations engage consultants, and so of course then you've got to find funding to bring in that person that's facilitating your strategic planning process. But other organizations just need to find funding for their board retreat, and maybe for doing, some assessments or surveys or something like that. And the last question that I think is really critical to ask yourself, and again, it's on the worksheet, for determining whether or not you are prepared to start a strategic planning process, is, does your organization have a history of implementing plans and policies and programs that it decides to do? Because the last thing that you want to do is begin a strategic planning process where the plan at the end of the day will sit on a shelf outside the executive director's office and gather dust. So this is part 1 of our strategic planning bonus break series. Again, we're going to have multiple parts. The next one, we're actually going to talk about the planning process that almost every organization or consultant uses, from the environmental scan all the way through to your final plan. Now, this bonus break and the Successful Nonprofits podcast is produced by the Goldenberg Group as part of our mission to provide board development, strategic planning, and interim leadership to help nonprofits thrive in a competitive environment. Be sure to visit our podcast website at successfulnonprofits.com, or find me, Dolph Goldenberg, at successfulnonprofits.com, goldenberggroup.com, on Facebook, LinkedIn, or Twitter. And if you think your organization is ready to begin strategic planning, reach out to me. I am currently booking new engagements for the spring, and this is a great time to get on my consulting calendar. Thanks for joining us for this bonus break, and I hope you have gained some insight that you will use to help your nonprofit thrive in a competitive environment.
I am not an accountant or attorney, and neither I nor the Goldberg Group provide tax, legal, or accounting advice. This material has been provided for informational purposes only, is not intended to provide, and should not be relied on for tax, legal, or accounting advice. Always consult a qualified, licensed professional about such matters.